Military's on a section podcast. Discussion, interviews, reviews, and rants. Military's on a science section podcast.
All right, well, welcome to the show. Today we are talking about plotting, but in the sense of you have just received a contract for a new series, and in our case, this is a military science fiction series, so this is definitely aimed at a specific audience. How do you, and it's a three-book series or three book trilogy to start, and if sales are good, it will continue to potentially be a longer series, or in some of our cases, it could be a much longer series that you don't quite know how long it's going to run. And
Right.
there was a question about this in the chat because some folks didn't like it when a story ended in an open way. Others, thought that yeah, you should just have a standalone book, or they wanted it to end in a way that was like reflected back on the story. And but in the current market we're working in, like this is kind of how things work. Like often you get this kind of contract for a specific kind of story, and you're going to do three books to start with, and then we'll see where it goes. So that's where we're going to start, and we'll see how much time we have to get deeper into it and actually setting up, what the shape of the book and how things, actually writing it. But why don't we start with our member who has done this the most? And Rick, how many times have you gone through this process?
Oh, I don't remember how many series I have. I think it's got to be at least a dozen, but it's probably more than that, like 14 or 15.
So I know sometimes there's a conversation, with the publisher, but they think Rick Partlow, they're thinking MILSF. A lot of times you got to convince them to do something else. But even, maybe if you could talk about when you first started versus where you are now with trying to do something different that's interesting to you. Like, do you start with a character? Do you start with an idea?
Um, it depends on the book. Some books are third person with a lot of different POVs, and usually when I start with that, when I start with that kind of a setup, I'm more idea driven. I'm more driven by like a concept. Uh, Whereas if it's a first person POV, I'm more driven by the character. Because if you're going to write a first person book, the character has to be pretty memorable and have a unique voice. Um, so for instance, the first series I ever wrote, Duty on Her Planet, I started with the concept for a one world government in a future society and how they would actually be organized. I came up with this with a friend of mine in a military history class in college. So that was the first thing I came up with, and went from there to, what situations would be cool to explore this, and then from there to technologies, and then from there to characters. And characters was one of the last things I did. But for instance, Drop Trooper, that series, I started with the character. It's like I want a character who's a Marine in a battle suit, who is agoraphobic, who's raised in these cities, hates to be, outside, and so the suit is like a shell for him that protects him from reality. And so I just started from that character, from his backstory, and I expanded outward to all the other characters and the situation he was in. So for me, it can go either direction, and I've gone both. Uh, I preferred starting with the character because I think the most successful series have a memorable main character, and that's what really draws people in. So that's the way I prefer to do it. Some other books I've gone a different way. The most recent one was World War Mars. I started with a concept, and then put the characters into it. So I've done it even recently, both ways. But like I said, I kind of prefer first person. I kind of prefer starting with a really memorable main character.
Who wants to jump in next?
I was gonna say is I have a saying for this, right? People come for the story, but they stay for the characters.
Right.
I always start with characters. It's always, I mean, that's not true. I start with genre, then I start with character, then I go to the character. A lot of times you'll hear people, you'll go online and you'll ask for writing advice. Like, I'm writing a story in this genre. How long should it be? Or what kind of character should it have? And you always get this sort of wishy-washy advice about, like, oh, as long as the story needs, or, the character that's best to tell the story. You really shouldn't leave that kind of thing up to chance. Every detail of a book really needs to be planned out. I don't mean like oh, on page 17 this happens. But I mean, like, if you're writing military sci-fi, you should know about how long military sci-fi books are expected to be, which is 100,000 words. You should know that male main characters sell better than female main characters. You should know that far future, I say far future, like 200-300 years in the future or more, generally does better than, tomorrow, that kind of thing.
About the
So,
day after tomorrow.
or the day after tomorrow. And so it's important for you, the author, as the creator of this story, to understand both like the storytelling aspect of it and the marketing aspect of it. Because you could write the greatest military sci-fi ever written, but if it's only written for you, then nobody else is going to read it. It has to be written for the audience that's there. And right now, that's an audience that wants 100,000 word novels. They generally want male main characters. They generally also want an audiobook to come with the book on its release. They want a good time on their investment. So, if you write a 50,000 word military sci-fi, that's roughly a 5 hour audiobook. That's not going to fly. So there's a lot of these details that have to be planned out before you even start writing.
So you can write just a book for just yourself if you're the target audience of all those MILSF novels.
Yes. If you know you're the target audience, if you know the reader looks like you, and in a lot of cases that's true, but in a lot of cases it's not. Authors think they are, but they're not. And so that's another important thing you have to know. Who is your audience, who you're writing for. It's like a lot of behind the scenes stuff before the fun of character creation and story creation and world creation happens. But once you get to that point, I usually start with the character. Like with Wraith, my first, or with Arsenal, I mean, excuse me, I wanted to do a take on Iron Man that was completely subversive to Iron Man, but still hit all the fun aspects of that character. And same thing with Wraith. I wanted to take a character, I wanted to take a person who was the least likely to be a vigilante, which was a former model, a black former model from Louisiana, and make her into the deadliest Punisher, John Wick, Batman-esque character you'd ever seen. And then same thing with Jacob Grimm. I wanted to take a character who was young, as opposed to like a lot of times when you're getting Navy ships, stories that revolve around Navy ships, they're like the old disgraced captain in the ancient ship that, just happens to have the magic formula to defeat the aliens. And people do that because they read other mil sci-fi that does that, then they go to TV tropes and they think that's how a story is done, and then they do that. And instead of understanding exactly why people like and read military sci-fi. And so I took a character who was least likely to succeed in that situation and crafted that character and then created the world around him, and the setting and the story and all that kind of flowed from what happens when this officer is essentially convicted of a crime he didn't commit and forced into punishment for something he didn't do that wasn't his fault. And it worked out really great. People really loved it. And then you take those kinds of characters and you put them in interesting stories, and they don't have to be original stories. There are no original stories. They just have to be interesting and not boring. Not boring or stupid.
Something that, I mean, I really believe this. Like, you move humans forward, 400 years, we're still going to do human things. Like, even if we're all silicon at that point, we'll probably still raise chickens somewhere. And I mean, we'll still be
Silicon chickens.
silicon chickens, but humans still want to succeed. They still want to do the right thing. They still respond to situations in ways that we would understand. I just think humans are going to human. And so that,
If I might
yeah,
give one slight counter argument to that,
uh-huh.
um, it has been said by some historians, and I mean, I don't know for sure. I'm not an historian, although I was a major in college. That if you took the average citizen from Rome in, around the turn of BC to AD, and you looked at him and his beliefs and his mindset, that they would be more alien to a present day American than the most alien from any science fiction movie.
I don't know about the
I
most
read that. I
alien, but
don't believe it though, because the what they're I think the perspective they're coming from is like, what is his religious beliefs, what is his political beliefs, what are his social beliefs, and that could be true. But at the end of the
Well, it's
day,
a mindset. The mindset that people had back then was so totally foreign to the one that we've developed in the modern day of things being logical and cause and effect. Back then, it was like the gods did it, and that's it. And I have no idea why this happened other than the gods did it.
yeah, but if you put that person in a position where it was their life or somebody else's life, you know exactly how they would respond.
Yeah.
If you put them in a position where they were going to lose all their money, you know how they would respond.
they still like to make babies. So
And they still like to make babies, and they still like, men and women, and it's yeah, the beliefs have changed, the day-to-day dailies have changed, but the core being of being human, of the need to survive, the need to prosper, it stays the same.
I mean, I think that's Rick brings up a good point. You can play with that. We've kind of talked about that, in the past, like making something that's relatable but also different. But I think that comes down, I guess where I was going with that kind of addition was characters in a situation struggling against something. Like that's still a thing that people relate to. And I mean, I think the same thing. Like I start with character because ultimately, like if I get stuck on something, if I've made a good character, I can, like if I know that person, I know how they would respond, then the plot writes itself in a lot of ways. Or if I can realize really quickly that the plot is working against, like I might have had this idea I wanted to do, but then the character that I made doesn't, like, you just realize quickly that I'm trying to force something on the character that doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, the reader's not going to like it. And then, you know, everything else falls apart. So I can always
Writers
come
do that
back
all
to
the
that.
time. The
Yeah.
last season of Game of Thrones. I mean, writers do that all the time. They have a plot and they don't care who their characters are, or what they're doing. They're going to put those characters through that plot no matter what.
Yeah, I hate that because, I mean, every book I write, just about the characters wind up taking over at some point. You know,
Mhm.
the first one more than any, Duty, Honor, Planet, the trilogy. By the third book, I had all these plans of this was going to happen and that was going to happen. And then I'm like, but what would she do? What would he do? He's not going to do this. He's not going to fall for that. He's going to have a backup plan, or the bad guy's going to have the backup plan. And it was, it just they took on a life of their own more than I'd ever imagined they would.
So Josh, when you, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about weaponized, in this context, but that would be the most recent one, I guess, where you
Yeah.
went
First rule
through
of
this
weaponized is
process.
we do not talk about weaponized.
We talk about weaponized. We're going to talk a lot about weaponized.
We're talking about it all the time.
Yeah. I mean, how did you
Um,
approach that idea?
so I kind of take a different approach from all of you in that I generally start with concept, and by concept I mean what type of story do I want to tell, and then once I have that in mind, I start thinking about the character in terms of uh, what kind of character does the story need, and then what can I do to make that character unique and interesting. And I should preface this by saying a lot of what we're talking about in terms of uh, technical aspects of whether you should start with character or story or what you need to do with your story, like Jeff was saying, male character or whatever else. A lot of that is high concept stuff, generally speaking, that we as veteran writers kind of understand intuitively, knowing the market and everything else. But if you're listening to this or watching this and you've never written a book before, or you're just starting out and you're writing your first book, a lot of that is just stuff you don't even really need to think about, because the core skills of writing don't really have anything to do with that. Now, that does go into writing a good book, but uh, like with a lot of things, you're not going to get really good at something until you fail at it several times. And I've failed multiple times, and I've written multiple books and stories that will never ever see the light of day over the years. And
Don't they say the first
probably,
million words are pretty
Right.
much throw away?
yeah, you could just
Yeah.
throw them in the garbage.
Well,
And
Josh,
I,
one thing before we get too far, can you really dig into how concept works for you? And so when you think about concept, like are you, is that coming from ideas you've been thinking about? Is that coming from the market you need to hit? How do you develop that or choose?
uh, I mean, I don't necessarily approach it from a market standpoint, just because that's not where I'm at in my author career, if you want to call it that. I'm not trying to hit a market. I'm just trying to write a really good book, the one that I want to write. In terms of Weaponized, I wanted to write um, a thriller in space, with kind of a Mission Impossible-esque structure. By that meaning, I've done series. I've done I think the longest series I did was 4 books, but I've done trilogies. But all of the series that I've written all contained one singular overarching series uh thread, right? Like one whole thing that carried over the series. And what I wanted to do with Weaponized was bring that down a little bit and not prolong, if you want to call it that, the actual story over 3 books. um but also not really do standalones. So what I'm trying to do with Weaponized is uh connect 1 and 2, and then connect 2 and 3. And if it does good, continue kind of on that framework. But the reason I kind of label it Mission Impossible-esque is because Mission Impossible, for the most part, most of those are kind of standalone movies. You can watch them and they're entertaining and fun, and you have a complete story. Of course, starting at 3, it kind of starts widening the scope a little bit. And then, of course, you have the last 2 now that are obviously direct uh, movie and sequel. But I really wanted to dive into the idea of doing like one focused story per book instead of over a series. And so when I started with that concept, I kind of uh, thought about what I needed to do to make that happen. And so I wanted a team of people that kind of like Mission Impossible, where everybody kind of has their own skill. And I didn't want them directly connected to the military, but I wanted some combat vets involved. I wanted a spy, in like Ethan Hunt, who is just kind of his own person sometimes, but then he also works with a team sometimes. And then because it's set in the future, and we've talked about tech and all that, I wanted someone who is really good with computers. And so I just kind of started with that baseline of 3 uh, titular, well, it's not titular, but main characters of what I wanted
Titular
to
is fun to
work
say
with.
though.
Yeah, it is.
You get the smart
So
points for this episode.
right. So I started with, I needed a combat veteran. That's one character. I needed the hacker. That's another character. I needed the spy. That's another character. And then a lot of my character development really happens as I'm writing the story itself. I try not to sit down and do like a big world Bible on characters and like know everything about them. I know like some main traits that I know that they need to have. And then I kind of work everything else out as I'm writing it. And then if it's something that needs to be seeded in, earlier, I'll go and do that. Um, but for this book, I wanted my concept was some type of gladiatorial arena in space. And I don't know why I had that idea. I just thought it was interesting. And so I took the Mission Impossible-esque concept and the characters that I had, and I worked out what I needed to get them all in the same place. And uh for lack of a better term, book one is a prequel to the story that I want to tell, right? I wanted to tell a team story, but the story, the inspiration for that was this, and this was interesting enough that it was a good introduction to the characters. It was a good introduction to the universe and the story. Um, and, there are a lot of books that just bam, start out with the established team. And I didn't want to do like the basic training story that we've talked about before. And I didn't want to really start from scratch, but I did want to have like a 0 point and explore that a little bit and give them kind of the motivation and reasoning for why they're doing some of the things that they're doing in the follow-on stories. So um, I I do a lot of extensive plotting on the story, not so much plotting on the character. Just because, I mean, you guys know this, the farther along you get into a series or a story and you're working with these characters, things pop up and you're like, oh, this is a good character thing, or I need some kind of motivation for this, or, something happened in their past or something like that. And a lot of that stuff just comes to you while you're writing. And so I leave a lot of that stuff out. Descriptions and all that I work out. A lot of that kind of stuff is arbitrary in my opinion. But like for instance, when I first envisioned the hacker as a young woman, I envisioned her with like bright red hair. And in this universe, they have kind of nano. I call them nan-twos, but they're nanite enhanced tattoos that you can control. They change color and you can morph them in different things. And I imagined her with really, really bright red hair, and that characteristic led to people not knowing her name, calling her Red, and all of that kind of stuff. But that a lot of that stuff wasn't really intuitive to her character. It was just kind of a descriptor, and that's mostly what I work out beforehand in terms of character. But I agree with all of you in that the character, generally speaking, is the most important part of pulling a reader back or enticing a reader to move forward with the story. If they don't like the characters, they're not going to be interested in the cool story concept you have.
Well, a perfect example is, we talk about Brandon Sanderson a lot, and I love Way of Kings, but the only story I'm interested in Way of Kings is Kaladin. Every time,
Mm.
every time it's one of the other characters, I'm just like flip, 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 flip until it's him again because I don't like them. I don't like any of the other characters in his
You
books.
you know what the eight deadly
Yeah.
words in writing are?
Huh.
I don't care about any of these people.
Yep.
And
Which is
that if
why I've
you
never read
I,
Game of Thrones because
if
I
I
just
if I get into a book and I'm like a few chapters into it and I don't care about any of these people, I put the book down. There's a book, I won't mention the name of the author because he's a good guy and it's a great book, but I got 500 pages into this huge book and I realized I don't care about any of these people and I just
I'm
can't
right
start
here,
reading it
Rick.
again.
Come on.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I don't think your books are 500 over 500 pages long.
well, Rick, I mean, what makes you care about a character then? Like when you're at this early
They
stage, you
have
got to
to
create somebody.
they have to be somebody I can identify with. They have to have some kind of redeemable characteristics, even if they're a rogue, if there's somebody, who's questionable character, they have to have some kind of redeeming features. Like Han Solo, he's a rogue, he's a pirate, but he's courageous
He's
and
also competent.
he's competent. There's got to be something
It's got a
about
heart.
a character that draws you in and when they get put in danger, you have to care if they get out of it. If I get in one too many positions where I like this guy has no redeeming characteristics, I would not have a beer with him. I don't like him. Why do I want to read about him for another 500 pages,
As
Yeah.
much as I loathe the book, the one point it makes above all else
Which
is
book?
Save the Cat. I hate
Oh,
that book.
Oh.
I hate that book because it's a paint by numbers for screenwriting and storytelling, which, I'm not a fan of. I'm a huge fan of story structure, but I'm not a fan of on page 9, this happens, on page 12, this happens.
Right.
It's easier to do that with screenplays because screenplays, generally speaking, are 120 pages long, period. And so it's easier for them to be like, okay, you got to have this happen on page 2 and this happens on page 10. But the whole idea of Save the Cat, though, is that your character does something in
mhm.
their introductory scene that makes you like them. And when you're talking about novels, one of the most important things you can do with a main character is when you introduce them with the thing that they are known for throughout the book. And that thing should be their best thing. It should be their it should be their best characteristic. So if a character is kind, then open the book with them being kind. If the character is brave, open the book with them being brave. Don't try to hide that from the audience. Because what'll happen is whatever your next thing that they do is, like if perfect example is Edge of Tomorrow. We talked about that before, right? This is a perfect example of how to do it in a way that will make you like a character, even if they're kind of despicable, is when you meet Tom Cruise, he's kind, he's competent, he's clearly good at his job, right up until the moment where the general is like, "Well, I want you to go on the front line," and
Right.
then you see his.
Oh, he's a coward.
If you had opened that
Mhm.
movie with him being a coward, it would have been a lot harder to like the character. Now, if you open your book and you want your character's fatal flaw to be um the color yellow, don't open the book with them wearing a yellow shirt, so to speak. Right,
Right.
Josh?
Well, and I was gonna actually tag on to both of your ideas, Rick's and Jeff's, about character expectations. I read a book recently, and like Rick, I won't mention the author. I don't know him, but he's according to the sales that I could see and the reviews that he gets on his book, he's doing pretty well. Um, but in this book, he did a horrible job at establishing his main character, and um I know this because I pushed through the first book and read the second book, and the character you get in the second book is nothing like the character he sets up in the first book. And whether or not you as an author know your character is well intentioned or good or whatever, say you're writing an anti-hero or a scoundrel or something, if you don't do a well enough job setting that up, and all the reader gets is negative, the reader is not going to like the character. And in this particular book, they set this character up as a murderer. They set him up as someone who's guilty of war crimes. They set him up as uh, beheading a Serbian mob boss, but also beheading this girl. And they didn't like really explain any of it. There was not enough to even draw a conclusion on maybe he's doing this. I didn't realize the setup until, and I'm pretty good at this. I didn't realize the setup until about 80% through the book. And then I was like, okay, now I get it. But the first 80% of the book, I hated the guy. I did not care about him. I actually wanted him to fail. And so if you're wanting to allude to the guy being a bad guy, but he's actually a good guy, you really need to be intentional about showing that the dude is a good guy, and then having the other characters think he's a scoundrel, because then as the reader, you know that the other characters are wrong, because you're the reader is the one that matters about liking the character. The other characters can hate that guy all they want, but the reader has to like them.
It's amazing how many times I see this, not just in books, but in movies,
Yeah,
that they don't think about the idea that the viewer or the reader have to want like somebody. There's got to be some
right.
character they can
Yeah.
follow.
How many times have you guys heard like, I don't have a main character?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes, you do. You do. You may not like your main character, but your audience most definitely knows who your main character is. And there's always going to be that person who's like, well, I like evil, complicated main characters. That's great. I'm glad you do it. You're 1% of the audience. So
Hmm.
let's just set out from right now what we are writing to sell books, to do this for a living. And that goes back to you're writing for you. If you like evil main characters that do evil things, that's fantastic. Enjoy writing your book. It'll be a great hobby. And obviously you're not going to find books like that on the market, but you're not selling that to an audience because there just aren't enough people who enjoy evil main characters to make
Right.
that work.
One of
And
the
I
great
think the
lessons
one,
of
An evil main character.
evil main characters. Yeah.
$1 million. About
Just really quickly too, I will say that the one recommendation I would have to anyone that's starting out or even maybe got a couple of books under their belt, um, your statement of not having a main character, a lot of times that goes along with people that are writing, kind of big sweeping epics, maybe space opera or even mill sci-fi that has a lot of different, characters with command level positions or infantry grunts or whatever. You can run into a very real problem of having too many characters,
Mm.
and then not being able to really expand or dive deep into any one of those characters. And if you set up so many characters throughout your series, you wind up with the problem specifically that you guys talked about, but with Brandon Sanderson, who where you're saying in the Way of Kings, you only liked Kaladin. I liked a couple of them, but I read the first five books, and the last book that he put out, which has been getting just destroyed in reviews and comments and threads and all of that.
Brandon, no.
There were so many characters, and even characters that I enjoyed and liked following in the previous books. There were so many of them, and he had to do so much with the space that he had, even with 500,000 words. There wasn't enough room to adequately address all of the issues and things that the characters were doing. And so I would recommend, keep your cast of central characters extremely small,
Mhm.
extremely small. D- eh, 9 is pushing it. Like
that's what I'm saying. No, never more than nine. Never
yeah,
more
I've
than
got
nine.
I've got 3 main characters. I've got, several secondary characters, and that's a different thing.
I
I'm
mean, I
talking
don't mean
about
like nine main characters. I mean never more than nine characters that are significant to the story.
for
Right.
sure. Yeah.
Because
I mean,
at
and that's a
that point you're
challenge
losing.
in MILSF because even if you're
Right.
writing like the story I'm writing right now is platoon level, that's 40 people, So like who do you choose? What jobs do
Right.
they have? What's important? What's not? Um,
Well, the common guy is not important. He can get shot.
no, the combo
Yeah.
guy is very important. So I mean,
One of the
but
things, go ahead. Sorry, James, go ahead.
just particularly about the combo guy. Like I combined that with the platoon leader's driver, so now I can, which wouldn't always be the case, but now I can put him close to command.
It's actually
So
the case a lot though.
well,
Like
I guess I never
Captain,
tried to do that because I didn't want them in the same vehicle as me if something bad happened. But I had the luxury of having a separate commo guy. So, but you're
to
right.
plot into the plotting, there is a problem that you run into when you're plotting. At least I run into it when I'm plotting. I don't know if you guys do. Is that I'll plot myself into a corner, and I think that's what Brandon did. He plotted himself into a corner, and he had to finish the story in that book, and there was just too much story to finish because he'd already said
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
the last book of that series, and
Sometimes
that
I think
happened.
plotting yourself into a corner is fun because it makes me come up with something I hadn't planned on.
Well, you need to start plotting my books for me
I
then
know.
because I do
So
it all the
let's.
time, and it's frustrating.
So why don't
Um,
we've spent a good amount of time on concept, and I'm really glad that we've talked about this because I feel it's one of the things that's really difficult for new writers, especially to dig into when you're thinking about a project, as opposed to just I'm just writing and it's fun, which it should be fun, but write with purpose. But now you talk about, okay, Jeff mentioned that the typical military science fiction novel is 100,000 words. That's 300,000 words for a trilogy. If certain things are going to happen, having that concept in mind and the number of characters you have, how do you approach like even writing out that initial thing? Like, are you a spreadsheet kind of person where you've got the number of characters and how many words each one should get and
gosh,
the
I
number of
wish.
chapters? I mean, I know people that do that and you
I
stare at it
do
and you're
it.
like, wow, and they check it off as they do each piece. And there are plenty of software companies that want to sell us software that does this for us. And then I know, like in particular, Rick, if you can talk about your process of just writing out the story, and how many words that typically is and how you do it.
I aim for 100,000 words, like Jeff said. I don't always get there. Sometimes it gets, 85 to 90, and I'm like, I could put more in, but this is where the story should end. So anyway, the way I work is I will write like a general background of what's going on. Like this is the world, this is the time, these are the people, and then I will do a synopsis of the story. Which the synopsis is me, like if I'm talking to Jeff and just telling him this is what the book's about. There's maybe some paragraph breaks, maybe not, but there's no attempt to do anything except tell the story of the book. Um, Then I kind of work that into a act structure. What happens, I put it into like 3 acts or 5 acts, depending on how I feel about it at the time. I like the 3 act structure because it's simpler. Um, and once I get that, which is going to be for 100,000 word book, that's going to be probably maybe 3 or 4 thousand words, you know, in the synopsis, maybe a little more than that even. Um, I will take that and I will take bits of it and I'll put it into a chapter by chapter outline, like maybe just a sentence here or a half a paragraph, sometimes more. And once I get that whole synopsis split into a chapter by chapter outline, then I can look how many chapters that makes up. And if it's less than 30, then I know it's not long enough. And I have to come up with some side plot or some subplot or something that's going to make it longer because less than 30 chapters is going to be a very short book. Um, but once I get it to where all of it's split up into 30 chapters, then I will go to each chapter and I'll start adding things. I'll start building bits of, like expanding what happens. If I think of a line of dialogue that I want to have in that chapter, I'll put it there. If I'm thinking of a place and if it's cold or hot, if it's a jungle, if it's a desert, if it's a city, what it smells like, I'll put all that in there too. And eventually it builds up to, for a 100,000 word book, should be an outline of about 10,000 words, maybe a little bit more, rarely less. So that's how I
I
do it.
usually, I'm kind of the same with Rick, where I kind of visualize 100,000 words is where I want to be at. I typically don't have the problem of not hitting 100,000 words. My problem is usually going over. For reference, Weaponized right now, that still needs probably 6 or 7 chapters added to it, is sitting at about 146,000.
Jesus.
That I'm probably gonna have to do some trimming. But
No.
I
Talking
yeah.
epic fantasy
No
side,
one.
we
Okay,
didn't do
listen,
it.
listen. There are a few things that you'll never hear fans say. If your book is good, you'll never hear fans say, "Boy, I wish it was shorter." All
Yeah,
right. You
exactly.
only hear that if the book is bad, which is, "Gosh, this book drags." Don't be
Right.
boring. But
Right.
especially
100%.
for a first book, and this is something working with Athon has taught me. No one's ever going to buy more books than they buy your first book. And when
Right.
you talk about Kindle Unlimited, every word over 100,000 is more money in your pocket.
Cha-ching.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, I start with the general framework of the length and then start thinking of the major plot points. I kind of visualize, again, this is kind of high concept stuff because I've been doing it for a while, and I'm sure the same thing for you guys, where sometimes it's more instinctual than really uh anything else. But, if I'm going at 100,000 words, then I'm going to want some kind of inciting incident to happen around 10 or 15,000 words. And it fluctuates. It's not like Jeff said, it's not page 9, this happens. I just know in this general area,
Get a feel
something
for it.
needs to happen. Yeah.
Mhm.
I know at the 50% mark, I need to be somewhere and something else needs to happen. I know by the time I get to the 75, 80% mark, I need everything in place so that I can end the book. Um, and then what I do is I just look at the major plot points that I have in mind, the idea or the concept for whatever situation I have, and then I kind of work backwards from there and then punch forward through my outline with what they need to get to that major plot point. And I've 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 done like 20,000 word outlines and I've done 5,000 word outlines. Um, uh, for Weaponized, I had a pretty detailed outline. For the second book, I had a pretty detailed outline. Um, but a lot of times, eh, like with what happened with Weaponized, I'll get to the end of the outline. I'll have written most of it and then realize that I made a mistake in the outlining process and then have to scrap some of it and go back and fix it, which inevitably that'll happen. Um, but what I have found recently, and what I'm going to do with the rest of book 2, is when I was working on this thriller last year, I got to a sequence that I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do with it. And so, the adage, show don't tell, which is an excellent adage. I took it in reverse and just told myself what was happening. And really fast, I wrote, 4,000 words of they saw this, they did this, they did this, this happened, and then wrote a sequence out like that to see if it worked. And then knowing that it worked, then I went back in and started basically coloring it. Actually putting
Expanding
dialogue
on it,
tags in.
unpacking it.
Yeah.
Right, right, 100%. And I found that that saves me a lot of time. And that's what I like to do with the book is itself. My outline is speed running the story. Um, but I know because I want to write with a thriller pace that my chapters need to be around 2,000 to 2,500 words each on average. And I know, and again, instinctually, how much I can get done in 2,000 words. And so that really uh, limits uh the boringness, if you want to call it that. And I'm always trying to get two or three things done per chapter in that 2,000 words. And 2,000 words for some people, that's a lot of words. But when it really comes down to it, it's not a lot. And if you're writing a big sequence, a whole sequence could be 8,000 words,
Yeah.
but split into the chapters, um, especially if you're writing multiple POVs, those those POVs get really tight and the action gets really fast if you're really focused on keeping those chapters shorter. And that's what I do. I look at it and I go, I need 50 chapters for this book. What can I do with 50 chapters? And then again, kind of backward outline from the main points.
If I could, there's one thing I wanted to add. This is all when you're talking about the first book in a series. This is all going to be very different than if you're talking about like book 15 in a series or book 10 in a series, because the longer you go along in a series, the less detailed your outline is going to have to be usually, because you know the
Yeah,
characters very well, and
right.
you haven't the situation, the background. I mean, like Drop Trooper, when I got to book 13 or 14, I could have like a 6,000 word outline and
Yeah.
leave most of it blank because I didn't have to put like, oh, this is what this character is going to think in this chapter. I already know what they're all going to think. So it gets easier to write the books, and you can pull more of it out of your gut the uh, the longer it goes on.
I will say from a publisher perspective, if you're looking, depending on where you're publishing, obviously, if you're publishing with traditional publishing, they're not typically going to buy a series from you if that's your first thing or if they haven't published you before. Um, so you're going to want to write a standalone book, and writing a standalone book is completely different than writing a series. But if you are writing a series, don't plan and plot a 9 book series.
Right.
Like Rick, he's what, 15, 16 books in Drop Trooper, and there's um
4 book arcs,
wholesale slaughter that has what, 5 or 6 books, I think.
sticks. Yeah.
Yeah. But Rick is established. We know as a publisher he's gonna follow through and really succeed with every book and gonna have sales there. But if you're just starting out and you're looking to make a name for yourself, or you're looking even to submit to a publisher, I highly suggest not putting in your submission, this is the start of a 9 book series, that
Hmm.
if you don't finish the 9 book series, the story won't be done. If you're
Oh, people
going
hate that.
to, yeah, if you're going to write a series, I would say the maximum that you would want to do is 3.
Yeah.
Keep your arcs to 3. Um, 4 is feasible, but 3 is a really good baseline for a
It, the,
series. And if
the
it
only
does
reason
well, then go ahead, Rick.
I would say the only reason Drop Trooper was 4 is because at the end of book 3, when I was doing book 3, I'm like, the war's not going to be over yet. I need a 4th book for this. And so
Right,
Stephen Rett said, "Yeah, go ahead." So
for sure.
it just wound up being 4 book arcs
Yeah.
because of that. But usually, I agree, 3 books is the limit.
Well, and you don't
I still
always
remember
know.
the story from when I first started out. Someone was telling me that they had written out a 28 book
Right.
series. They're like on book 6 or whatever, and nobody was buying it. And they're like, "Well, but I
Right.
promised 28 books," and I'm like, "You're an
Shouldn't have done
idiot,"
that.
you know.
That's the thing. You don't
Yeah.
know what the
Yeah,
audience
shouldn't
is
have
going
done
to
that. Yeah.
respond to. Like you could think in your mind it's going to be great, and maybe you had something previously that was great, but audiences can be fickle that way, and it's it's more to open the door and have those ideas in the back of your mind, like, with Rick the Tawny War, or the way Jeff has set up overarching wars in the world, so that you've got the door open to do other things. I haven't read Weaponized yet, but I assume the gladiatorial combat probably opens the door to, other things in the future. But
It is fun. It is
yeah,
fun.
but that's the thing. You've got that background there, so you can do more if the readers want more. But the thing that
Right.
really makes readers hate you is if you have written to that, whatever 4 book mark, the books aren't selling, and then you just stop, because then you
Yeah.
kind of lose the
Well,
ability to even sell those books as a whole thing later.
especially if you're the person that's saying, "Ah, I've got this 28 book series that I have planned," and um now you're slogging through whatever 6 or 7 books for one cool thing to happen,
Mhm.
and no one wants to read that. If you're gonna write, you want like multiple cool things to happen in each book. You don't want to have a bridge
Don't
book
save
or
it
a
for
bridge.
season 2. There won't be a season 2.
Right.
Yeah.
100%. If you've got 8 really cool ideas and they can fit in the one book that you're writing, put all of those ideas in that book. Because A, who knows if you're gonna be able to write a second one, but B, there's always gonna be new ideas to
Yeah.
to throw in there. And really quickly, I want to comment on that. I can't remember exactly what the comment was about, a commentary on war or whatever, that each book needs to have some kind of reflection on that. Um, I I'm of the opinion that if you're writing a book as a commentary on war, okay, you can have that commentary. But if that's not the point of your series, then you don't need that in there. It could be a byproduct of something that happens. Um, Specifically, I wrote a standalone in the Galaxy's Edge universe called Strikers War, and that was supposed to be a commentary on the merits and uh, ideas behind the Order of the Centurion, or their version of the Medal of Honor. And so that book specifically was a uh, not a reflection, but an exploration of what it would mean to receive that recognition or that award. And so in that book, there was a kind of reflection at the end of the narrative, that I didn't pound it, but you felt it when you read it. And I had the reading of the order and the ceremony and all of that. And for people that have been through that, that resonated really well with those veterans. And that's what the book was supposed to do. But for Weaponized, I'm not trying to proselytize about the merits or evils of war. I'm not actively trying to make a point about anything at all, rather than just telling an entertaining story. So even if it's a mill sci-fi book that is about war, there is not always a need or a necessity to put in commentary on whether or not it was right, or any of that. If something directly affects your character, then obviously you can explore that. But
And we do have
sometimes,
we have that episode on, rah rah versus I can't remember what we called it exactly, but um, the realities of how you represent war,
yeah,
And I think going deeper into something like the Medal of Honor is really to help people understand what that means, and to do it fictionally. Like, that's a pretty awesome statement. Actually makes me want to. I haven't read Strikers War yet, so it makes me want to take a look at it.
it's one
Um,
it's one of my shorter ones. That one I
yeah,
managed to keep around 60,000 words, if you can believe it.
my take on that was, if you were doing characters the way I would like to do characters, like, if they're thrown into combat, whether this is their 100th, brush with getting shot at, or their first, like, having real human feelings about that is a commentary on war, and a commentary on, and that's the thing, like we've talked about in the past, like viewing a war from the general's level to the private's level, and describing how that, what that can look like, and how each person has their different motivations for why they do something. And obviously we're writing in a genre that's trying to find the heroism and the human parts of what war is. And so I don't know that you have to reflect back on it. Like if you're doing it throughout, I guess is my point there. Like the whole thing is a
100%. Yeah.
reflection on what war is, right? And how people
Right.
respond to
If you
that
have like a
situation.
specific commentary you're trying to get across in your narrative, you're probably gonna fail just because, it comes off as preachy. If you have
Right.
something you want to say in your book, use themes to say it. You
Yeah.
know,
Actually, in my opinion, if you realistically portray war, if you have an idea of what war is like, if you've been to it or you've talked to people who have, and you realistically portray it, you don't need to have a conscious commentary you're trying to make, because war is a commentary unto itself, and people are
Mhm.
going to take from it, the lessons that people usually take from it. In I don't think in any one of my series that involved warfare that I made a commentary on the nature of war, um, other than people, are not happy to be having to be fighting in one usually. But uh, I made commentaries on how people react to responsibility, how they react to having other people's lives in their hands. But the nature of war is something that, as humans, we kind of have a natural reaction to. And when you try to make it a specific commentary from your political or philosophical point of view, I think it rings hollow, because everybody's going to see this war if you did it realistically, and they're going to have their own feeling about it. If you tell them, "Oh no, my feeling is the right one and yours is wrong," then they're not going to like your book.
Right. And I don't know that the commenter was going that deep into it, just that they like to see that kind of thing, that it
Right.
shows the author's thinking about it. It's not just, pew pew, you had a fight. Um, I mean, I don't know. I read a book, it wasn't MILSF, but it was still
you read a book, James?
I
You're
know I
talking
read a
about
book.
Who has
So I
time
remember
for that?
Matterhorn. Called Matterhorn by Carl Marlantes, and it's about a platoon leader in Vietnam, and they just keep retaking the same hill over and over again. And the book, I mean, you're just in that platoon leader's POV the whole time, and it is so relentless. Um, but he didn't have to say that this is bad. He just showed it.
Right. Right.
And and by the time you're done with it, you're so tired. Like, I would still recommend the book because I think it was a well-written book, but it definitely helps you feel what it was like to be in that situation as a leader, um, in that time period. So you don't necessarily have to make a blunt statement about it. Um, so I don't know. I mean, the Forever War, which was brought up as an example, was, I think, a book from a specific time period responding to Vietnam. And so a lot of people were reading that as like, it was pretty difficult to read that book at the time without thinking of Vietnam. And someone might read it now and not see it that way and get other things from it. So, um, I don't know. You should read that. Vietnam or Forever War is a great book too. You should read it.
Oh yeah, yeah,
So,
for sure.
I liked it up till the end. I didn't really like the ending.
see, I don't remember the ending, so I got to read it again, I guess.
I
I just remember the time dilation. Like I
thought it
just
was
read
I
another.
thought it was anticlimactic at the end, but
It's so funny. This could be a whole other story, but the storytelling evolves over the years. And in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, books tended to just end.
Mhm.
It just ended, and that's the end. And it's funny how like we build our stories based off of stories that we read when we were younger and now, and we complete them, right? We take one more step forward. But then, back then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, those authors didn't really have a lot of middle sci-fi authors to read to know what the
Right.
next step was. They had a
Right.
story, they told the story, and then they just ended it. And now we have all these sort of advanced storytelling techniques where you have ending mirrors the beginning, and you have all this other stuff to make it very satisfying that we know that they didn't. But we're still standing on their shoulders to write. So it's pretty cool when you
Yep.
look at the whole
Agreed.
thing.
Agreed.
And
Okay,
on that
so
note,
we got through concept and we got through like initial plotting.
Well, that's what
So
I said. It's good. We
I
could
know.
talk about this kind of stuff for hours because a
apparently
lot of this.
we're over talkers.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's probably okay in this business. All right. Well, hey, we'll try and get to the next pieces of this process. Because I
We
think
should
it kind of
actually
gets.
follow up with making a plan to do this in the very next episode.
I know, I know. Great, we have the plan for the next episode. We
Yeah.
also have some interviews planned that we need to get those scheduled so that we know they're happening.
Are we
So,
doing the one interview we're talking about today via text? Are we doing that next week? Can we announce that?
is it set up? Is it ready?
I thought, well, it can be either next week or it can be the week after. I'm not going to be here next week, so
Oh, it'll have to be a week after that. We all need to be here for that.
Yeah.
We should all
Right.
be here for the interviews.
No one knows what we're talking about. We're trying to line up more interview guests, and we'll have more about that as the time comes. So look forward to that. Okay, well, hey, thank you for hanging out with us, and we will see you next time. If you haven't done the things, the liking and the subscribing, tell people about the show, hang out with us in Discord. I really appreciate all the activity happening in Discord and Facebook. And now we can salute. I'll see y'all later.
Wakanda forever.